social inclusion is a broad topic, and we have here a set of speakers that are coming from different angles. So why don't we start with maybe a quick 1 minute or a couple minute intro so people understand on different angles. Sure.
Okay, I can start, that's fine. So hi everyone, happy to be here. So my background is that now we're building a crypto Kickstarter for social impact, where we're creating an algorithm called Proof of Positive Impact, where we're actually creating a database matrix where people get paid for actually doing social good based on the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. In terms, it can allow transparency of where the funds are going, where donations are going, eradicate corruptions, and build new kind of organizations where we align the interests of all the stakeholders around a token that's part of that's representing of the social shares of cooperatives. So that's in a nutshell, quickly.
Hi, I'm Renu Bhatia. I'm sort of a serial entrepreneur and an investor. I'm particularly interested in the fintech space in terms of financial inclusion, and also my particular startup in this space is in the healthcare space. Both of these topics are particularly interesting to me because I'm based out of Hong Kong, and both of these things, the idea of social inclusion and healthcare, have enormous impact on how our societies and civic societies are developing in that part of the world.
I'm Doug Shinsato. I'm a member of the Board of Regents for the University of Hawaii, and I'll be talking about the impact of blockchain on research versus non-repeatable and fake research. But my passion is really telemedicine and healthcare. And in many countries, the big problem after the provision of healthcare service in rural areas is the huge proliferation of counterfeit drugs, which not only depletes poor people's life savings, but actually kills them. So we'll be talking about that during our panel discussion.
Hi, I'm Samia Brouwer, and to follow up on my neighbor, so I'm the co-founder of doc.ai. We have built an ecosystem on Ethereum that enables people to collect and own all the medical data, and to be able to share that medical data for data trials, for research trials, that is shared with data scientists to compete for predictive models. So at the core, we are an AI company. But at the end of the day, we are rebuilding the symmetry between the different industry stakeholder in the healthcare and patient, because this has been incredibly asymmetric so far. And everything is fueled by a token called the Neuron. We did an initial coin offering last year under the form of a securities offering, and we are launching our public beta very soon and a commercial ecosystem in October.
All right, I'm Jason Potts. I'm director of the Blockchain Innovation Hub, which is a research center at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Our sort of claim to fame is that we're the first social science research institute in the world. We're essentially a team of economists, mostly, in this space. Our sort of big argument, and the reason in the context of this panel, is that we see blockchain technology as new economic infrastructure. And what that enables us to do is to essentially create, this is the foundations for a next generation of civil society. And we see the impact here as new economic infrastructure for charities to be able to do things, for groups and communities to come together and do things. And it's that sort of empowerment of civil society that we think is going to be transformative around the world.
Right on. So I will introduce myself, but I am Francois, founder and CEO of Dotted Square. Shows Jason that I've got a background in Microsoft, at MIT rather, and also at Microsoft. My perspective is more from the angle of fintech and modernization of the financial infrastructure in order to bring together people who are excluded from that system today. So with that, maybe we can start with, we've got a good set of people around so healthcare, we've got a good set of people around that economic infrastructure, and that investments kind of split half and half. There's a lot of interest on healthcare. So why don't we start with a few words on healthcare, and what's the big opportunity out there? What's the big pain point that we're solving? Why is it that blockchain is useful here versus not using the blockchain instead?
Well, healthcare is such a large topic and has many different angles, and we've got huge expertise here as well to answer this. But let me start off where I see, particularly coming from Hong Kong and that part of the world, where I see huge potential opportunities to create real impact. There's a difference between perhaps making money for a particular company, but also then having impact. And one of the things that we have is looking at epidemiology and the way disease is moving and outbreaks. So if you look at China, there's more than 250 million people that are moving into the urban areas. Now, one of the things that does is, while governments may have been very good at, for example, having health records and vaccinations being done in their rural communities, when this mass migration occurs into the urban areas, the question is, did they really have those vaccinations? Where are those records? How are they being kept? And it sounds a simple solution, but it isn't. All that money that's been spent on vaccinations, if we do not know whether those have been kept, then that presents a real problem, because essentially we can have outbreaks of diseases again that we've spent so much money eradicating, like polio, because we missed a few people. So that mass migration of people, if we can put those vaccination records onto the blockchain, has an important impact. The same way in the refugee crisis that we're having, that movement of people in Myanmar, etc. The other big issue with the health records, and I'll touch upon because we have more expertise here, is in the drug discovery, fake trials, cost of bringing trials down, finding the right people and who have these diseases to be able to be part of the trial. Bringing down the cost reduction is an important part. And particularly in Asia, unfortunately, we're beset with fraudulent drugs, which costs the pharmaceutical industry $2 billion or more, and yet we also lose lives. So that tracking of medication is a big part, and there's a lot of companies in Asia that are looking at that whole space of provenance and tracking of not only the medication, but also food. You know, we've had many incidences of fake foods, fake milk powder, fake rice. So I think all of those have social impact and policy impact on healthcare.
Yes. A year ago, I was very fortunate enough to be invited at an international pandemic conference. And some of the other speakers were world-known researchers in pandemic monitoring and prevention and immunologists. What was interesting is my presentation focused on my efforts with a Japanese company that had proven technologies. And this was just after the Ebola crisis had broken out, and they were trying to collect sizable samples of blood from people in Sierra Leone. So what they did was they offered as an incentive free meals, free non-alcoholic beverages. Nobody showed up. Then, because this company had a huge entertainment network, they came up with the brilliant idea of broadcasting for the first time football from Europe. And so 5,000 people showed up. Then they started showing some blockbuster entertainment in the local language, and 20,000 people showed up. So they were able to get 20,000 blood samples. The immunology specialist from the National Institutes of Health in Washington, D.C. was able to use that as the basis for coming up with an Ebola immunization formulation within 3 months. The problem then was that the Japanese company said, okay, with our proven technologies, with what we know about providing healthcare to the Sierra Leone rural population, we can extend mortality from the current age of 40 to 60. And I know we're talking about social good, we're talking about community impact, but I said, I don't think that's a very good idea. And they said, why not? I said, if you extend the life of a 40-year-old Sierra Leone male to age 60, imagine the huge economic and financial burden it puts on the younger population that is still working. And most of the people who are already 37 or 38 in Sierra Leone are either illiterate or semi-literate or innumerate or semi-numerate. So you think about the huge social impact, which would probably lead to social instability and possibly civil war. So when we talk about doing social good, there is always the law of unintended consequences. But I'm still moving forward with telemedicine, healthcare, and then providing technologies where healthcare in most rural communities across Africa is still something that is non-existent. The average villager will have to spend a whole day catching buses and trains to get to the nearest clinic where the most senior medical practitioner is a semi-trained nurse. So these technologies are great, but tying back to blockchain and tokens, the tokens we talked about were great incentives to get the village people to coming out. Most of them have cell phones, smartphones. So you give them tokens and you say, you know, you can trade these tokens in to play a game or a carton of beer or a week's supply of chicken. But we saw that as a huge incentive to get people to gain access to legitimate healthcare.
Yeah, and you know, we talk about developing countries, but when it comes to healthcare in the US, more than 80% are absolutely disgusted by the healthcare system. And the number one reason for personal bankruptcy in the US is medical bills. We don't need to leave the US to experience that disaster. And so on one hand, there is extreme frustration and a broken system. On the other hand, the big opportunity, I think, is that because just collecting medical records on the blockchain, it's not enough, plus you can't store that on the blockchain, but you need to decentralize and use the coordinates. But I think having a token to incentivize, and to your example, you know, if you know how to engage people, how those 5,000 blood samples were collected is a huge example. But what is very important right now in the healthcare industry, and that's a great opportunity, number one, there is not one single industry out there that is not in search for predictive models. So all the biggest companies out there, especially those who have not been through that transformation, have tons of data. We come from an area where everybody was talking about big data, but that data is toxic if you don't have the models to do something useful with that data. That's number one. Number two, regulators are saying we need all to be more transparent. So GDPR in Europe saying it's over to collect people's data without clear consent is a huge leap forward for companies to change the way they collect data and to go for full consent. But also what happened with Facebook is, you know, as clearly reason awareness around transparency and ownership of data. So it's like having a big momentum to make things happen and using what the blockchain can help us leverage on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sam on this, but I'd actually push this even further. I think there's a lot of stuff going on with blockchain and healthcare right now that's transformative. In one sense, it's taking a bunch of problems that are hard, tracking of fake medicines and so on, and a thing we're already trying to do, and just providing a better solution because it lowers the cost of doing that. And just in that sense of trying to do a hard, crazily important thing that will help the lives of billions of people, tech. But there's another thing that's going on, and what I think is actually the fundamental transformation here is what's happening to the property rights of data. And that's the one that it's kind of baked into this, but it's important to keep your eye on it. What's happening, what blockchain enables with sort of private key, public key permissioning is the ability for me to permission my data, which means I can own my data, which means that the previous model, the previous property rights and therefore economic business model that we've had, which is that which harvests the data owns the data by default. And then you have to set laws and all sorts of things around a thing to deal with that, privacy issues and so on. We just solved that architecturally in software by creating a system where the default setting is actually it's data that can then be permissioned. That's what's just shifted. Now that opens up the possibility of data markets, which opens up the possibility of new business models in terms of providing data, paying for data. But I think that's what has just happened, and we're still trying to figure out the implications of that. But
I think that's true, but I think there is a cultural element to it and a societal element to it, because what we are also seeing is enormous data being collected by the very large companies, particularly in Asia, like the likes of Alibaba or Baidu or Tencent. But the idea of monetizing that data or having individual rights to that data is not so advanced yet. It's not so clear, because at that moment it's going into a central pool, which is essentially the government. And I think, but I agree with you, it's that when we get to that next level, which is people understanding, and I think you're right, Sam, when you said the Facebook issue brought that up, the idea of who owns that data and whether do I have access to it. All kinds of data, whether it's your healthcare data, whether it's your financial data, etc. That's where the leap forward becomes really important, because that's my data and how I monetize it, whether it's for credit, whether it's for social impact, you know, how I do that becomes the real leap forward.
Right.
But there are different societies.
Okay, but what is not in dispute then is that there is economic and social value in massive pools of health data, right? The issue is how we create those pools. So either we enable companies to get very, very big to create these pools, and the same thing is happening in social media as well, or we allow regulators and governments to force those pools into existence. Both of those solutions have massive privacy problems or governance problems.
Or Equifax, for instance. So
yeah.
all centralized, flat files. They got hacked once, and all of a sudden, all social security IDs are floating around. So I think we're touching on a very fundamental topic, which is data ownership, data sovereignty. Who owns my identity? Who owns my electronic health records? You know, so today you put your passport. Your passport is yours to keep. Yeah. You don't put it in a safe. The bank doesn't keep it for you, although you could do that. You could go to the bank and have it kept for you.
So
now,
can I add on something here, because you are putting a question here of who would own our data, but actually what you can do now with blockchain is that you can create a public ledger where, like, even the company who is running the ledger is not going to own the data that's being run on the blockchain. So actually, this is like solving the issue of data privacy.
So yeah, so I think I think it's a really important topic, and I'd love to have the panel talk about it in the sense that blockchain. The interesting thing about blockchain is that it keeps the data. I mean, when you look at Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the likes, keeps the data forever. That's the intent, essentially. The data is non-corruptible, but also it's here to stay. So you talked about, Jason, about permissioning data on the ledger, and I think that's something we should talk about right now, where I put my identity on a blockchain, for instance. What happens to it within the framework of GDPR, for instance, when you mentioned that, Sam, and how does it work? So just very briefly, we're looking at from a different standpoint than blockchain from the perspective of .square, but I'd love to hear what you guys are.
Well, I mean, I see sort of things like GDPR and these other sort of initiatives that are designed to solve a privacy problem in one architecture, and the actual solution is actually just a different architecture. So in a sense, you know, it's a barn doors and stables and horses.
But I think maybe just because maybe not to focus too much on healthcare, but to finish for healthcare, there's something very specific to the healthcare industry is that for decades, people who generate the data have not been able to own it, even not to access it or collect it. This has been a huge struggle. Yeah. So now, because there are APIs everywhere, there are ways to create importers and reclaim that data. You can also do that for financial and so on, but it has been harder for healthcare. That's why. So privacy by design with the blockchain infrastructure, absolutely, but problem is how do you reclaim all that data that is all over the place.
So,
and a good example of that is just how expensive medical trials are because of the cost of the permissioning system and you don't have the option right now of me just going, actually, look, I'm just going to open my health data and I'm going to permission it to only things that are legitimate in a sense.
With my company.
All right, fantastic.
We're actually pushing a data trial in a few years.
That's what we've been waiting for. Is that the previous architecture just made it really expensive and hard and slow to pull data for medical purposes.
The cost plummets when you can get access to this. Otherwise, it's like $80,000 per person on a clinical trial by some estimates, and you can bring that really down. But I think along with that, we have to educate people because I think a lot of people wouldn't actually know what that data was being potentially used for. I'm just saying, as a general thing, we need to educate them.
Well, we've been approaching this from a privacy and fear perspective because the previous architecture just made you think that was the rational response, rather than thinking of your data as a personal capital asset that is of value to others. And what's interesting is who it's of value to. It's not like value to doctors. It's basically AI diagnostics that it's of value to. It's basically when it's pooled with other data that you can then run exploratory investigations over that. So it's a and that can be done anywhere around the world.
And so now you're pointing the issue of like GDPR and like privacy, the data that you construct on the blockchain, but actually other sorts of decentralized ledger technologies can provide the same benefits that blockchain are having, but without having the GDPR issues or privacy issues. So what about that? I mean, like for me, it's pretty straightforward. Like decentralized ledger technologies has really the potential to solve this without the issue of blockchain. So it shouldn't be such a big debate.
But I mean, just to be clear, the whole logic of a permissioning-based framework is that you don't need regulatory protections because I'm only sharing my data. I'm either sharing it or transacting it or exchanging it, but I'm only giving it just by definition to someone or something that I actually want it to have. I don't need a regulatory protection in that world. It's just completely unnecessary.
Yeah, once you own the data.
Once you own the data. Once you've got a property rights system that is a permissioned.
And you understand what that means. I think that's important. I mean, I don't think.
But when it comes to social impact, are there other examples that maybe we might have because, in banking or owning property? Because I think there's one theory that applies to everything. You can't really change what you don't own, right?
Right.
And so what are other stuff that people don't own on this planet? And
well, an example is your transactions data, your banking data. So the open health agenda has a parallel in the open banking agenda, and it's the same thing. It's that you don't own your bank records; the bank does. That which harvested it owns it.
But you have non-stop access to that data.
Actually, so if the bank has my data, and whenever I use my credit card, actually even the cashier can see my first name and last name. I buy a kind of soda. How is my privacy handled? It's kind of an interesting question from the current system standpoint versus what blockchain may offer, or maybe decentralized system. Because we keep on using the term blockchain, which is a permanent record, but is it that there's a way also to create decentralized systems that are non-permanent when necessary? So if I so desire to withdraw my identity from maybe close an account, or maybe this fundamental risk wherever I live to have my name there, can I do so? So is that something that we can implement with decentralized systems?
Well, I would argue that there's very little agreement on the cost of transferring ownership of what would be called private data and taking that away from data aggregators. And I think there's more agreement on the financial benefits of supply chains, because you can measure how much with blockchain, how much with tokenization you save in each step, because you're confirming that something is not counterfeit. You're confirming that something only used 25 kilometers to transport as opposed to the 30 that might show up on a doctored invoice. So I think there is probably an easier path to arguing the benefits of blockchain and tokenization in a supply chain situation where people understand how to measure costs, as opposed to looking at the transformation costs, moving from a data aggregator who generates huge valuation and then giving that back to individuals.
Got it. So,
Not sure I agree, but.
So this is an interesting topic, and we mentioned earlier also people going bankrupt from the cost of healthcare. So it kind of touches different aspects. So we talked about healthcare for a bit, and you also mentioned, Jason, a little bit of the financial infrastructure or the economic infrastructure. So how does blockchain enable? So we've seen countries such as Qatar, Dubai, going full blast on blockchain. We've also seen, and we're talking to Kazakhstan that's doing a brand new setup on the financial side. So there's the AIFC, an organization that works for the modernization of the financial infrastructure of Kazakhstan. So there's a lot happening where countries are opening up building what's the future of geography that will welcome blockchain. So what's your take on what's next from a financial infrastructure, and what are the key aspects of enabling not only people who are outside the current financial system, that are pushed out from inclusion standpoint,
so that's an infrastructure we're actually building with Serendipia. And now we have to know that 900 million people don't have access to clean water and food every day. But at the same time, 33% of the total food production is being wasted. And we tend, from researchers, we tended to believe that one of the biggest burden to that was misalignment of interest and incentives among different stakeholders. Consumers of a company don't have the same incentives as the shareholders. But then now, with tokenized organizations, we can put we create more liquid cooperatives and more liquid organizations, where in the case of a cooperative, you have to be a shareholder, or a social shareholder of a cooperative, to be a customer. So at once, you align the interest of founders, investors, advisors, employees, and customers on the same line of interest, which has the potential to at least align the incentives of everybody. Now, if you couple that system, that principle of aligned organizations and collaborative organizations with a transparent financial statement and social impact assessment tracking, you have a transparent way to see how the money of a social impact investor is impacting actually the issue you are trying to solve. At the same time, seeing how your money is being spent, and in that way, you can eradicate corruption. And corruption in economy, it is the biggest burden to economic development worldwide. We don't know how the money is being spent and where the money is going. So I think eradicating corruptions and aligning incentives is two big ways in which blockchains would allow to create a higher standard of living from people from around the world.
Traceability, understanding where the money goes and where it comes from. Mm-hmm. So that ties it kind of together with also healthcare and the supply chain.
Can I try and just make a sketch of, I've got quite a strong view of where I think the future is going in this sense, in terms of the economies. Everything we've been talking about is taking the existing problems we've got in the supply chains don't work, identifying problems, going blockchain will fix that, yes. What I think this technology is bringing in is post-industrial, post-capitalism. And what this will look like is pre-industrial, pre-capitalism. It'll basically take us back to a world of the sort of 16th, 17th century, where we didn't have factories in the same sense that we didn't have these mass pools of large organizations to pool capital to do things. Instead, what we had were households. Now we're describing these as community organizations or just things. Groups of people come together to do a thing. Right? That's used to be how the world was. It was just very local and small, and you couldn't do very much because you didn't have a lot of capital or you didn't have a lot of coordination technology. So the power of that economy was very limited. But the awesomeness of that was you didn't have to commit to a 25-year exercise in building a huge company. With now blockchain technology, with what it's doing to property rights, what it's doing to smart contracting, what it's doing to the ability to form organizations and to form cooperatives and so on, is it gives us the ability to come together in these fluid, liquid sort of forms to form cooperatives, groups, to do a thing, whether it's a sort of the same thing we would identify as a charity organization or to just whatever it is, to have the institutional governance to manage the just keeping track of things, distributions and payments and so on, to do that thing and then once it's done, move on. We can do that at a global scale now. It's just as effortless to do this anywhere in the world. And it's that vision of that type of economy where we've got all of the powers of modern industrial capitalism and so on, all of the institutional forms, but far more flexible, far more able to be formed and reformed. And I think the main thing that will happen is this distinction between profit and non-profit businesses will blur. And a lot of things that are currently done by charities will get a lot more efficient.
Right. Is there also maybe a tension between the government and decentralized organizations? So when you say we're going back in time, in a sense, that's...
Well, back then we didn't really have governments doing very much at all.
That's right, exactly.
There was very little role for them.
We're going from a place where there's a set of institutions, for instance, central banks and such, back to a time where things were not operated that way with as much regulators. When you look at the history, it feels a bit like there's a balance that goes between more government strengths, more popular strengths, and then back and forth.
But not just big government, big corporations as well, or just big corporate hierarchical organizational forms, whether these are governments or sort of very large organizations,
I think it gives the power back to more of the smaller communities, enabling to potentially structure themselves. And I think that is incredibly empowering, because not only does it do it from a corporate structure perspective, but it also allows a number of things to happen, particularly when it comes to, and I'm just going to bring it out there a little bit more, is the idea of what is valuable and what skills do I have and how do I monetize that, not just in terms of data. It goes back into the music industry. You know, we've looked at how that industry has been changed by very large interests. So, you know, you have emergence of K-pop, you have emergence of big manufactured bands, etc. But simple things like being able to have smaller, more indigenous music, more music that appeals to a smaller group of people potentially, being able to be on the blockchain, have the ability to write it, being able to present it and have it paid for, allows people to develop their skills in a very different ways. I mean, if you look at it, 87% of the IP that exists out there is not in the patent and trademark world. So, and that means there's a lot of IP that's underutilized. And that system of patents and IP is, trademarks is broken down. So if we can timestamp it and put it on the blockchain, we can actually free up the SMEs, etc., to develop that economy more, rather than be in the hands of the larger corporations. So this is empowering in many different ways, not just from you know, the voting aspects, but more on the democracy side, and putting the power back into the SMEs and the individual, because they have access to how they spend their time, how they look at the data, what skills they have, and how they can actually monetize that skill. And that's extremely valuable going forward. And now.
I think related to that is this whole idea of the promise of transparency. I think in most countries, in most regions, it is the large financially powerful institutions, whether they're banks or corporations, that use their political and financial muscle to change the regulations to suit their ongoing ability to remain powerful and financially sustainable. So the transparency is very important in terms of governance, but that takes a long time. And in many cases, it leads to civil war. Yes.
You remove intermediaries. That's how Bitcoin started. It's really like, you know, peer-to-peer. I mean, that's very powerful. That's how it started to be able. I mean, one of the first big impact was, you know, on those billion of people who could not have a bank account.
Jean-Loïck.
Yeah. So I mean, you've started to talk about like post-capitalism and like pre-industrial. But I think what blockchain and token economics will bring us to is a post-abundance world, where, because in the end, to build on what you just said, like blockchain will bring more creativity and flexibility to the economic landscape, but also it will allow people to like retain the value they are creating and being accountable for it and show that they actually do it and put a timestamp on it. But just to finish the point of actually abundance, is the idea of programmable money that we don't talk about it yet, which for me is the most important, and I think that overall in the blockchain world is not very approached yet, is that you can create now a token that will leverage on behavioral incentives, behavioral economics, and behavioral finances to actually, just like a game like in The Sims, like to incentivize people to like behave in a certain way. So like now we're creating a protocol called Proof of Positive Impact, where we allow people to actually get rewarded for the amount of social impact and amount of good they do in the world. So my dream is that actually the richest people in the world are not the one with the most money, but the one making the most good in the world.
That, the behavioral, I just got to put it up, because the behavioral economics is so important, because we have a world where not a lot of the diseases that we're faced with are due to chronic the health choices that we make in terms of diet, in terms of, we're all looking for the magic pill to solve our diseases, but most of them can be resolved to a large extent by changes in our diet and changes in our exercise. So the idea of behavioral economics and being able to incentivize that and in a tokenized way, perhaps, again, and monetize that, perhaps will shift that burden on the healthcare system that we have at the moment to the individual.
So I just want to push back on the phrase post-abundance, because I think that that's part of the problem here, is that that's a legacy word that makes us think that the real economic problem is scarcity of physical stuff. If only we had more stuff, if there was more abundant stuff and we could distribute the stuff, everything would be fine. But the revolution that you described in terms of is actually not more stuff, it's better software, better governance, better organizations. It's a massive fall in the costs of us coordinating and organizing. Yeah. That's what just happened. That's how that's where the wealth is.
The capital is there. It's just
of resources and getting rid of the middlemen, and also making those economic efficiencies being passed down to the end user. And it goes back to that whole idea potentially of barter trade, peer-to-peer transaction, with the degree of transparency and the trust that the brings.
Peer-to-peer, like barter, for me, is even like compared to what you can really do with token economics, is even like is a backward, because you can really be a lot more creative with the way you are programming that money. Like anything is possible. You can get rewarded for any kind of behaviors. It will be like implemented automatically with the use of like AI and blockchain at the same time. So and it allows us to enter in an era of competitive governance, where you will have like a lot of micro communities and micro governance are going to compete for members or citizens, where as a citizen you will be able to like plug in and plug out of different ecosystems. And
to be honest with you, when we started with doc.ai, so when we decided to tokenize, we had a tokenomics and it made sense and it worked really well, and the idea of rewarding and building that symmetry, we did not realize how deep it would go. That part, data is currency, currency is data. You can go so granular, it's crazy. So we are in an era of data science where we can follow the data, understand, and what doesn't work, we ditch and we build something else and so on. But imagine doing that with currency, with a token. So it's the entire chain that you can understand and where you can help people behave or evolve. It's for me, it was one of the big aha moments of the last 3 months. Yeah, really, when we started to test, it was like, I did not realize how deep it would go.
All right, so we're just about to run against time. So maybe a few last words each, maybe in one sentence. What's your thinking around blockchain and ethics?
Okay, so I think in general, like blockchain and decentralized.
Just one sentence. Like 3 at least.
He's French, he can't keep it to one sentence.
So like, in general,
and
I think,
I'm French too. So.
Okay, so just like to finish, like the blockchain is just a technology, and what's really, really important now is to think of the consciousness, values, and ethics while putting behind the creativity and what you are creating. Because now, like, we have the power, a tremendous power, and it can like break or make us. So just think of like how conscious you are when you are building things on the blockchain.
I think particularly it's an extraordinarily powerful technology, but I think we really, in order to really make the impact and the change that we're all wanting to make, we do need to have almost public-private partnerships, particularly in several of the industries happening, so that you can actually have that adoption. And a very simple example of that is land rights titles. A large proportion of economics in emerging markets is tied up with the fact that nobody knows whose land it owns. If we can do that, we can free up a large part of the economy, but does need that public-private enterprise to come together to unleash the social impact.
And I would say that all of us who've attended this conference believe in the future and the promise of blockchain and tokens. Forbes recently published an article saying the world's top 10 companies have invested billions of dollars on their future strategy that involves blockchain and tokens. What none of us can in truth say is whether this becomes another .com bust or whether it becomes the next big thing. And we heard on a panel yesterday, that what's very important is for those of us who are converted and believe, communicate with the outside world who have no understanding of the promise and the benefits of blockchain or tokens, and to gradually educate them on how we can talk about a lot of economic benefits, but also a lot of social good.
I've been an entrepreneur in tech and science for the last 25 years, and my big first aha moment and why I started was because of the internet, and I was blown away, and I honestly thought it would be the first big and last revolution in my entire career. With the blockchain, I'm going through that transformation again because it's infrastructure, obviously, and it goes very deep. What I find fascinating about it is that it has the ethos of the open source movement community and with the features of the private market, and I really like that combination. And so the only thing I want to say is, yeah, if you are involved, just build the best platform you can, the best product you can, because that's the best way to advocate for it at the end of the day.
Yeah, so what I think that the social impact here is that in the past 10 years, we've had a seismic event has just happened to sovereignty, in the sense that sovereignty has suddenly got a whole lot smaller, and it's down at a human individual scale, and we can start to rebuild sovereignty and the institutions of that, of governance and contracts and privacy and data, and all of these things are being rebuilt at a level of not just individuals, but individuals in small communities and then up from there. So that's what just shifted. A sort of 1,000 years of sovereignty being done at the level of kingdoms and so on, suddenly just very recently flipped. And now we're in the process of rebuilding that. And I think what that does is that we've got to keep an eye on words like privacy and so on, just because their meaning just shifted. And that's what we're adapting to and the ethics of that.
Interesting paradox. The walls are going up on the national levels, and yet the technology that we have is actually global, and yet we're moving away on the trade and front into more national structures.
Yeah. Right on. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll
Great.
conclude.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. No microphone.
Okay. So please, questions.
First of all, I really wanted to thank all of you for all the wisdom sharing with us. Since the topic of this is social impact of the blockchain economy, and incredible work is done in this space, what area would you like the blockchain technology, where do you see that there is no implication of blockchain? So let's just, to state the fact, energy, we are using blockchain, banking, housing, farming, healthcare, entertainment, and politics. Is there any area where you would like to see blockchain to make a difference? A. And the second part of the question is, the idea of empowering people has always been very famous, but again, is that centrality affect the politicians or some people controlling that? It takes over, and then I know some of you have discussed that. How can we assure the same thing wouldn't happen with blockchain? Thank you so much.
So an example, just to jump in on this, in terms of use cases that should be more front of mind is refugee resettlement. It's basically an identity ledger problem of missing ledgers. And it's not just a who is that person, but it's also associated with the occupational licensing of the reason that often countries don't want to accept them, even though they've got skills shortages and the very skills that the person has is because of occupational licensing, going into teaching and nursing, whatever. And again, ledger problem of identification. So we've got these huge social problems that actually are right in front of us. That are actually fundamentally ledger problems around identity and credentialing and licensing and so on, that we could really move the dial on this. If there was a sort of broad consensus that that's the type of shift that we have, or that's the potential of this technology. So, in terms of, what I'd like to see is not so much run through a list of industries, but to run through a list of big social problems that look intractable, but are actually caused by the architecture of how we do our institutions at the moment, and just to start reimagining that.
And something else also to your point, which is that much of the regulation have been built over prior decades, prior centuries even. And the technology has evolved quite dramatically. And so now we're in a paradigm where we've got biometrics. How do we handle biometrics? So people without identity. So the financial system is quite interesting, just to pick one vertical, where so half the adults in the world do not have access to banking services. That's 2 billion people. Why is that? Is it that the technology is not enabling them, or is it that the regulation is not enabling them? You could argue quite a bit, but the refugee example is a very good one. So if I'm a refugee, I don't have a proper identity. How can we capture that? The reason I don't have a proper identity is it's not I'm not a person. It's just that the technology that's typically used, the paper technology or what's in place today, does not allow for these people to properly be identified. We have the means to change that with biometrics again. Blockchain is a technology that can be leveraged to recreate infrastructure, but there's many other options, of course. And so I think it's a critical point in time that we're witnessing today. With Bitcoin and blockchain as an entry point for innovators to make a claim on what could be the next iteration on regulations. That's our personal standpoint, at least at Dotted Square.
I think the identity would be key, and an example of that would be India. If you look at what the Indian government has been able to do on the Aadhaar system and giving 1.2 billion people an identity using their thing, that has opened up an enormous possibilities for them in terms of getting bank accounts and getting credit and getting agricultural subsidies, beginning to pay their taxes. I think it fundamentally shifts how you structure society and brings a level of transparency into that system. So that is an example which has many permutations, but it solves with one thing, which is an identity which such large populations do not have. And I think in terms of aha moment for the emerging economies, just like the mobile phone allowed them to leapfrog. Many of these countries do not have the legacy infrastructure that they have to break down. So by adopting the blockchain, by adopting this, they can bring in a level of transparency and efficiency into these markets and thereby actually leapfrog in a way that would not be possible. And that, to me, personally, is a huge promise of this industry. But it's not a panacea. I think the problem with many of us who sit along these things, blockchain is seen as a panacea for all of our problems, and it isn't. We have to be selective in how we utilize this technology.
Mm-hmm. So to add on all of this, I think a lot of things are being done already in blockchain technology, but you ask what you would like to see more done, and I think the potential of programmable money, to actually code how value, now we live in an era where we can literally redefine what value and money transfer is called. How are people being rewarded for what they are doing? Coming back again to the behavioral economics point of view. But that's really powerful, because think about it. Now using those data and blockchain, we can actually reward people for making others feel good. And with IoT devices that will maybe measure your heart rate, your heartbeat, and your temperature, your body temperature in different experiences. So imagine you go to the restaurant, but then you reward more the restaurant for how they make you feel. And that's just a small example, but then that applies to social good, to how you feel, to how happy you are.
But let me give you another example of where you could go with exactly that. Yeah. Is a global universal basic income, which was basically a smart contract equity swap of I'll give 1% of my income to a random 12 other people in the world give it to me. We just do this mutual arbitrage sort of swap, only possible because of programmable money. And now we've got a global welfare system based on as a universal basic income that's only possible through this technology. So just fundamental new options to rethink welfare possible.
Thank you for a very insightful panel.